going to, sell him for 20 pieces of silver. And I think all the while, knowing it, what does he call Judas at the Last Supper? He calls him friend, right? Or I'm sorry, in the Garden of Gethsemane. Friend, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? And I don't think that he's saying that sarcastically. He really means that. All right? He really means what he's saying. And what am I saying here? I'm bringing all this up to say that Christ didn't become cynical of his disciples in spite of all their misgivings, in spite of all of their problems, in spite of all of the weaknesses and the sinful frailties that he had. Christ could have thrown up his arms and said, these guys are hopeless, man. I just need to keep on looking for somebody that's perfect like me. And he could legitimately have said that. But he said, you know what? No, I'm going to choose to leave the fate of this message, the gospel message, in this misfit's hands. And I'm going to ascend up into heaven and I'm out of here. And I'm going to give him the Holy Spirit to help him out, but it's pretty much dependent if the rest of the world hears the gospel, it's dependent on these guys. Now, somebody who's cynical can't do that because you're too busy being critical to have faith in anybody, to trust anybody. All right? And so a disillusioned person has developed this habit of unending criticism in their life. And when you get there, you are capping your effectiveness as a leader. You're capping your effectiveness as an influencer because you can never get to the point where you can trust anybody. And it's all out of fear of getting hurt again. If Jesus was too afraid that Judas was going to betray him, he would have never chose Judas in the first place. But Jesus' main motivation was not that I'm afraid of getting hurt. Because Jesus' main priority in life was not to avoid pain. It was to do the Father's will. And sometimes in order to do the Father's will, it might mean that we get hurt. It might mean that we have to suffer somebody stabbing us in the back. What are you going to do? Not influence somebody? You're not going to engage with anybody? You're not going to trust anybody that knows more than you, that could teach you something, but you're not going to open yourself up to influence because you're afraid they might hurt you? It might happen. But living totally capped spiritually and in other ways in life is worse to me, at least in my assessment. It's worse than experiencing pain. I'd rather go through the pain of possible betrayal. Rather go through the pain of possible, and with Christ, it was definite betrayal. It wasn't possible. He knew the future. And yet he chose Judas anyway because his main objective is not to avoid pain. His main objective is to do the will of God. All right? So we have to be careful about this unending criticism. Let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 2 through 4. Is that in your handout? Okay. So 2 Samuel chapter 15, we find the story of Absalom. And I think most people in here know the story of Absalom. All right? And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, Moreover, Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. So here we were reading the account of Absalom stealing the hearts of the men of Israel. All right? But let's back up here a second. So in reality, Absalom is very subtly criticizing his father David. That's what we're reading here. Not every criticism is Sometimes criticism is camouflaged. Sometimes someone with a critical spirit is a chameleon. Not everything is just in-your-face criticism. I hate that guy. All right? Sometimes criticism starts this way. It'll start with you're in a conversation with somebody, and they don't know how you feel about a certain subject, so they're going to check the waters first. Right? They're about to be critical, but they're going to check the waters, and they're going to say, so what do you think about fill in the blank? And what they're doing is they're checking to see how you feel about it before they unload. Because they know how they feel about it, and what they're looking for is somebody else to identify with. Because birds of a feather flock together. Critical people seek out critical people. So then that really has to force you to ask yourself the question, this person said this to me, why did they feel comfortable saying this to me? Do I come off as a critical person? Do I have a critical spirit? Because it's very easy to say, that's the person with the problem. You wouldn't believe what they said to me. Why did they feel comfortable saying that to you? Okay? Absalom here is stealing the hearts of the men of Israel who are coming to, these men, these people, the Israelite people, would come to the palace to be judged. All right? When they had a dispute, it's like Judge Judy, all right? Only David is at the desk, all right, the bench. And before they would go into the palace for judgment, there would be Absalom be standing at the door of the palace as guys would go in and come out. And hey, come on over here, talk to me. Hey, how's everything going? Oh, you look great. How's the wife and kids doing? Awesome. Hey, so what brings you here today? Oh, really? And they tell him his story, because everybody wants to tell him your story. Tells him his story, and he's like, man. Verse 3, see, thy matters are good and right. It doesn't matter whether they're guilty as sin. I murdered 38 people. See, thy matters are good and right. Right? He'd say this to everybody. All right? So it starts with flattery. Okay? He's about to flatter them. See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. The king has a short oversight here. You know, instead of trying to hear all of the cases, he's doing too much. Instead of hearing all the cases, he should let me, or let somebody take some of this load from him. All right? Verse 4, and Absalom said, moreover, oh, that I were made judge of the land. You know, if I was just judge of the land, I guarantee you I would rule in your favor. Right? And it sounds very innocent. It sounds like, oh man, he's a nice guy. Right? But what is it? What is the primary purpose of it all? To criticize David and to steal the allegiance of the hearts of the men of Israel. All right? Now, why? Now your notes don't cover this, but let's go back to 2 Samuel 13 really quickly. All right? 2 Samuel 13. It's amazing the domino effect that happens when we mess up, and the dysfunction that sin causes. 2 Samuel 13. So in 2 Samuel 13, we find a very cringy story about Amnon. And it came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Now it just so happens that Amnon is the firstborn son of David. Amnon is set to be the next king of Israel. Firstborn was first in line to take the throne. And Amnon has a sister. It's really like a half-sister, not the same mother, but the same father. Amnon has a sister named Tamar, all right, and she's beautiful. And Amnon is so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, unquenched lust for she was a virgin, and Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to harm. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. And I've preached this to youth groups and teenagers, that your friends and your influences really do make a difference in your life. And David's brother, and Jonadab was a very subtle man, etc., and we know the story. And so it turns out that Amnon ends up raping Tamar. All right? But what's interesting is, let's see here, what verse? I should have wrote it down. But it says in this chapter, when David finds out about it, David is very wroth, but he does nothing. All right? Now, it's very interesting to me. If my daughter was raped, I would definitely want to do something about it, especially if I'm the king, and at my word, I could say off with their head, and their head is gone. All right? If I'm the king, you better believe I'm going to, and I have the power to do something, you better believe I'm going to do it. But he's very mad, he's very wroth, but he does nothing. And, as I've analyzed this and I've looked at this, the only conclusion I can come to is that David is wrestling with guilt over the fact that he had an affair with Bathsheba, and he's kind of guilty of like the same kind of sexual sin as Amnon was. If Bathsheba was non-consenting, it's the exact same sin. The Bible never says whether Bathsheba really consented to it or not. But the point that I'm trying to make is a lot of times as parents, we look at the sins of our past, and that makes us gun-shy about passing judgment on our kids. Well, I did the same thing, so I feel like a hypocrite telling them not to, which is completely insanity. That's complete insanity. It's like, I see them heading for a cliff, and I drove off of a cliff and, was in a horrible car wreck and disfigured and marred for life. But I see them driving off the cliff, and I don't want to say anything because that's the same thing I did, so I feel like a hypocrite telling them not to drive off a cliff, which is nuts. But this is how David feels, right? So David doesn't, even though David's angry about it, he doesn't feel justified in disciplining his oldest son, Amnon. Well, his third oldest son, Absalom, this is his full sister, Tamar, is his full sister. And so Absalom becomes very bitter and angry toward David because David didn't do what Absalom thought David should have done. And honestly, what David should have done is discipline Amnon. So it's this big family soap opera. And so Absalom, bitterness builds up in Absalom to the point where Absalom ends up conspiring and slays Amnon. And David is mad about that too, but he does nothing. Why does he do nothing? Because David feels guilty that he didn't do anything to Amnon. He didn't discipline Amnon properly. And if he would have disciplined Amnon properly, it might have mitigated some of Absalom's anger. Maybe it would have avoided some bitterness in Absalom's life. But because David felt gun-shy about disciplining Amnon in the first place, he does nothing, and that builds up bitterness in his other son, which, how could you predict that? Most of the time, we can't predict how our sin is going to affect and what effect it's going to have and how far-reaching that effect is going to be. But I said all that to say that this is the reason why now, years later, all right, Absalom has killed Amnon, and then David says to Absalom, Absalom kind of runs away because he thinks David's going to kill him and everything. And then David says, all right, fine, you can come back and you can live in Jerusalem, but you cannot, but you're not allowed to see my face. So they live like that for 2 years. And this is David's way of dealing with the problem. David's way of dealing with the problem is just by not dealing with the problem. You can't deal with the problem by not dealing with the problem. This is the way I default sometimes to doing, where it's just like, if I ignore it and I put it in the back of my mind and I don't think about it, then it'll go away. That doesn't work. And so this whole time, because David did not discipline Amnon properly, and David doesn't discipline Absalom properly, and it's this, when you're dealing with discipline, okay, avoid lengthy, as much as possible when you're a parent, avoid lengthy discipline measures. What I mean by that is try to come up with discipline measures that are quick so that you can, but effective, but that you can get your point across and then restore fellowship. Don't implement discipline measures. You're grounded for 3 months. Okay, but during that 3-month process, you and your child, because there's this discipline that's constantly there, it's kind of like a wall between you and them. And as long as that wall is there, they're going to grow apart. You're not having as much influence. There's not that relationship. All right? This is why you don't find grounding in the Bible. You find spanking in the Bible. Because the spanking is quick and it's over and it's done and the fellowship is then restored. And I understand, when they reach a certain age, 16, 17, 18 years old, spanking is, they're a little bit grown out of that. I think I was 16 when I got my last one, which you can question my parents' wisdom there, but I'm alive, I made it, so I lived through it. But my point is that when you initiate grounding for months on end, I'm taking this away from you and you can't have it for a week, and then they give you an attitude 2 weeks, they give you an attitude 3 weeks, and they continue a month, and in the heat of the moment you increase that to the point where it just becomes unreasonable, and then halfway through or a couple days into it, you cave because you feel bad that you lost your cool in any way, and so you cave, and then nothing is learned, and you give them back what you took away. No discipline is accomplished there, and all that you're doing is you are contributing towards you're teaching your kids to manipulate the situation, and you're also contributing toward them building up bitterness towards you. And this is what happened with Absalom, to the point where years pass, and now Absalom is conspiring to steal the kingdom away from his dad. It's all that he can think of. To the point where he is slowly, methodically, meticulously stealing the hearts of the men of Israel in chapter 15. And verse number 6, and on this matter did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Now, how does this apply to what we're studying here, disillusionment? Absalom, all that Absalom was in Absalom's mind here when he stole, and by the way, it doesn't end well for Absalom. Absalom ends up dying. Absalom ends up losing his life early, because this disillusionment took a hold of him, and all he could see. If you say to him, tell me, when you think of your father, what do you think of? He would not have said to you, sweet psalmist of Israel, man after God's own heart, the greatest king Israel has ever had. He would not have said any of those things. All he would have said to you is, he allowed Amnon to rape my sister and did nothing about it. He's the worst king that Israel ever had. I'm going to try to overthrow him and overtake him any chance that I get. You know what that is? That's a bitter heart that can't see past unending criticism. Yes, Dave, and as to us, the third-person observer, we look at David's life and say, yeah, he made some mistakes, but he was still the greatest king. Apart from Jesus Christ, he's the greatest king that Israel ever had. Slew Goliath, did all these great things. The high watermark of Israel's prominence throughout history, thus far, even till today, the high watermark of Israel's prosperity was during David's reign. It reached the pinnacle under his reign. And Solomon kind of, after David, but Solomon was blessed because of David, and Solomon didn't finish well and lost the blessing of God. So anyway, my whole point is that there is a lot of good things about David. If we're really going to balance it out, if we're going to examine it from a balanced point of view, David was, comparing to like Ahab, all right, or some other kings that Israel had, David really comes out with a good report card. I'd give him an A as far as being king of Israel. But what would Absalom give him? Right? And you see then how the disillusionment and how the unending criticism skewers your view of reality to the point where you can't see or say anything good about that person. There was a pastor. We got to quit at 7:32. But there was a pastor who that was kind of one of my heroes growing up, and every time he preached, I would listen to tapes of him preaching, cassette tapes back when remember cassette tapes, and I would listen to cassette tapes. I had my Walkman. Put the cassette tape in there. And I would listen to him and going through Bible college and stuff, I would look forward to going someplace where he was speaking and hearing him speak. He traveled all across the country. And at one time, he pastored the largest independent fundamental Baptist church in America. They were running about 10,000 people on a Sunday. And so, anyway, in 2012, it came out that he was having an affair with an underage minor, teenage girl, driving her across state lines, and he's still in prison today because of it. I don't know exactly when he'll be getting out. But when that happened in 2012, now he wasn't a close acquaintance, so I didn't fall to pieces or anything, but it was surprising, to say the least. And he started to be attacked after that by preachers all across the country because he was very influential. And so pastors and preachers from all across the country started to say, and they had his books, they were throwing his books out, and just completely, he's such a hypocrite, such a fake, and trashing him and everything. But because of my previous experience with my pastor that I was called to preach under, and how he stood up on a Wednesday night and said, "I'm no longer qualified to pastor," like I've told you many times. And going through that, I had to reach a point where I had to make a decision. And when I think back and the historical timeline of my life, I had to reach a decision of whether or not I'm going to trash everything this man taught me, or if I'm going to realize that he's a human being that fell, and that not everything that he said, that doesn't make everything that he said bad. We live in cancel culture right now, right? So let's just cancel them. Let's just trash everything they've ever done. Let's flush them down the toilet, and let's pretend they never existed. But you understand that some of the things that he taught me make me who I am today. And I'm in the ministry today. I surrendered to the Lord under his preaching and under his teaching. And I'm in the ministry today because of him. So he's not all bad. He's just human. And this is how we understand that. This is how we avoid the unending criticism. Because in reality, when we become so critical where we criticize everything that person has ever done, and that person is Adolf Hitler or worse, realistically, what we're looking for now is we reach the conclusion then that in order for anybody to ever influence me, they have to be perfect. If I'm ever going to learn anything from anybody, they have to be Jesus Christ. Well, guess what? You're not going to learn or be influenced by anybody then, because Jesus left here 2,000 years ago, and he's not coming back until he returns on a white horse and he sets foot down on the mountain there and walks through the eastern gate of Jerusalem. So if you're going to be influenced or taught anything between now and then, it's going to be by a man or by a woman. It's going to be by a human. And those people are imperfect, and they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to sin, and they're going to let you down, and they're going to do things that you wouldn't do. But we have to realize, how do we escape this unending criticism thing? We escape it by realizing, don't take your eyes off of you. Understand, if they're imperfect because they're human, then you know what? I'm human, so that makes me imperfect too. But by the grace of God, there go I. But by the grace of God, when someone gets full of themselves and pride, or thinks that, whatever may contribute to a person's fall, any one of us are capable of doing the exact same thing, because we're all sinners. And so that's how we avoid this unending criticism. If Absalom could have just seen past the infraction, if Absalom could have just seen the situation through his dad's eyes, he still may not have agreed with the decision that his dad made of not disciplining Amnon for raping his sister Tamar. Of course, he would not have agreed with that. But at least looking through the situation through David's eyes, he might have been able to understand how his dad did what he did. Even though it was wrong and even though it was sinful, I see how he did what he did. I see how he went wrong there. And you know what? That doesn't make him a terrible person. It just makes him human. And I can forgive him. But to the universal, the person that's unending criticism, we jump to the conclusion that this person is evil, and that they're evil through and through, and that's all they're capable of, and we trash anything good that they've ever done for us, and we cancel them in our mind, and we move on like they never existed. And when you do that, that's a sign that you have some disillusionment here. And that is going to be an obstacle to your spiritual growth. All right? A very famous preacher once said, he made this statement to a group of preachers. He was preaching to a group of preachers, and I think I was in the audience. I either was in the audience or I heard it later on. But he was talking to a group of preachers, and he said, when I address my church, I tell them this. He said, not all of you like me, but each of you do. What that means is, he said, I know that there's some of you that don't like me, or you don't agree with some of the things that I've done, or whatever. But he said, when I go to shake each and every one of your individual hands, I don't think that you're the one that doesn't like me. And he's just talking about the mental state that he disciplined himself to have. He said, not all of you are for me, but each of you is. And so that is a great way to overcome that critical spirit, that critical mindset. You cannot afford in your spiritual life, if you're going to get along with brothers and sisters in the church, if you're going to allow yourself to be encouraged and to be taught and to be influenced, you cannot allow yourself to get in a critical mindset and get cynical to the point where you're past being influenced anymore. All right? So, letter A, unending criticism. We'll pick up with letter B next week. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you, Father,